This is not breaking news. This is not a scandal. This is not about one person. This is about a system quietly discovering that its safety locks may no longer hold. What you're watching did not start with a vote or a phone call or a threat. It started with something far more dangerous: normalization. Power being tested, then stretched, then treated as personal property, not loudly, not all at once, but just enough that people stopped flinching. And now, something unusual is happening. Not outrage, not rebellion. Resistance from inside the structure that is supposed to protect power, not challenge it. That should make you pause. Because when the people closest to the controls start pulling their hands back, it's rarely about politics. It's about risk. Stay with me. Because what looks like a disagreement is actually a warning signal. And once you see what triggered it, you can't unsee where this is headed. If you want to understand what's really being tested right now, don't look away. We're only at the surface. Here's the mistake most people make when they look at moments like this. They look for the villain, a name, a personality, a temperament, but that's not what's in control here. What's in control is leverage. The modern presidency doesn't run on persuasion. It runs on access to extraordinary authority. Authority that can be activated without consensus, without delay, sometimes without explanation. War powers, emergency declarations, executive discretion that expands precisely when resistance appears. This is the real center of gravity. Not elections, not approval ratings, but the tools that allow one office to move faster than every other part of the system combined. And for years, the assumption was simple. Those tools would be used carefully, rarely as a last resort. That assumption is now under strain, because when authority becomes reflexive instead of exceptional, the system stops asking why and starts asking how much. And once that shift happens, personalities don't matter anymore. Only precedent does, which brings us to the quiet change almost no one noticed while it was happening. Stay with me. For a long time, the most dangerous changes didn't look dangerous at all. They looked procedural, temporary, reversible, before extraordinary powers came with friction, deliberation, public argument. Now, they arrive with press releases before invoking them carried political cost. Now, it carries political utility. That shift didn't happen overnight. It happened through repetition. Each use made the next one easier. Each exception softened the rule, until the question stopped being, should this be allowed? And became, why not use it? This is how systems change without alarms. Nothing breaks. Nothing collapses. The architecture stays standing while the load quietly redistributes. And here's the part that matters. Once these powers are normalized, restraint becomes optional, not illegal, just unnecessary. That's when the system stops protecting itself and starts relying on individual judgment, which works until it doesn't. And when it doesn't, the shock doesn't come from outside. It comes from a moment so specific, so concrete, that it forces people inside the system to finally say no. That moment has already arrived. The moment didn't announce itself as a crisis. It arrived disguised as a safeguard, a procedural move, a formal check, one of those dusty mechanisms most people forget exists until it's activated. But this time, it wasn't triggered by opposition. It came from inside the perimeter. Lawmakers who rarely intervene did something rare. They moved to constrain authority before it was used. Not after damage. Not after consequences. Before, because of language. Not actions, words. Words that treated force as hypothetical, as negotiable, as something that could be discussed casually, even when it carried irreversible weight. That's when the system jolted. Because when force becomes conversational, preparation follows quietly. Plans form. Assets shift. Timelines compress. And intervention windows close faster than the public realizes. So the response wasn't loud. It wasn't theatrical. It was preventative. And that alone tells you how seriously this was taken. because systems don't preempt unless they're afraid of what happens next. And what happened next wasn't de-escalation. It was rage. Here's what that reaction revealed. Not anger. Anger is expected. It revealed a theory of power, a belief that authority, once granted, should not be interrupted. That internal resistance is not governance, but disloyalty. In a constitutional system, that belief is toxic because the system is designed to absorb friction. Checks are not obstacles. They are load-bearing walls. But when power is experienced as personal ownership, those walls feel like insults. And this is where the mechanism becomes visible. When friction increases, the response isn't negotiation. It's bypass. There is a tool built for that, emergency authority. It centralizes decision-making. It accelerates action. It dilutes oversight. And most importantly, it reframes the narrative. Oversight becomes obstruction. Questions become threats. Process becomes weakness. Under an emergency, the system stops asking for permission and starts asking for compliance, which explains why emergency language tends to appear at the exact moment scrutiny tightens. Not randomly, not coincidentally, mechanically. And once that switch is flipped, the people who benefit are never the ones absorbing the cost. That cost travels downward, quietly, and quickly, which is why the next shock didn't slow things down. It sped them up. The pace changes here, because once emergency logic enters the system, everything accelerates. Authority compresses upward. Accountability thins out. Decisions move faster than explanations. Announcements outpace evidence. Oversight arrives late, if it arrives at all. And suddenly, multiple pressures collide at once. Internal resistance, expanding authority, unanswered questions. Instead of clarity, the response multiplies complexity. New creases, new declarations, new urgency. Not to solve the original problem, but to drown it. This is how attention gets managed. One issue never stays still long enough to harden into accountability, and the system feels busy. Active, urgent. But busy systems are easier to control than focused ones, because focus creates records. And records don't move. They wait, which is why the most threatening thing to this kind of power isn't opposition, it's documentation. And that's when the machinery everyone ignores starts to turn, slowly, methodically, with consequences that don't care about tone or volume. And once that process begins, escalation stops being a choice. It becomes a race. This is where it reaches you, not as theory, not as procedure, as impact. Because when authority concentrates and oversight slips, the consequences don't stay abstract. They land in ordinary lives. When force can be initiated without consensus, it's not officials who deploy. It's families who wait. It's communities who absorb uncertainty. When emergency powers redirect resources, it's not the system that tightens its belt. It's you, through prices, through markets, through instability that shows up quietly, then all at once. And when transparency slows, when records stall, when explanations lag behind decisions, something else erodes. Trust. You start to feel it before you can name it. Rules feel softer. Commitments feel conditional. And the ground under long-term planning starts to shift. That's why this moment matters more than the headlines suggest. Because it's not about whether one action happens. It's about whether the system still responds when pressure is applied from the inside. Stay with me. Because once that question stops being domestic, it doesn't stay contained. Systems like this don't fail in isolation. They ripple when internal limits weaken, external actors notice. Not because they're watching personalities, but because they're watching patterns. Allies calibrate, markets adjust, commitments get reinterpreted. What once felt fixed starts to feel conditional. And that uncertainty travels faster than policy ever could. Defense assumptions shift. Economic forecasts widen. Diplomacy becomes more cautious, less certain. Not because anything has happened yet, but because something might. This is how local stress becomes global signal. When the rules governing force and authority appear flexible, even temporarily, the entire system surrounding them compensates quietly, preemptively. And that compensation has a cost. Partnerships slow. Confidence thins. Stability gets priced at a discount, which feeds back into the original system, amplifying pressure at home. This is the loop most people miss. The moment restraint becomes optional in one place, volatility increases everywhere else. And once volatility becomes normal, the future stops arriving gradually. It arrives in jumps, which brings us to what happens next. From here, the system doesn't move in a straight line. It branches. There are 3 paths. The first is adjustment. Limits reassert themselves, not dramatically, but persistently. Resistance holds. Processes slow things down again. Authority remains powerful, but bounded. Nothing breaks. Nothing explodes. The system absorbs the stress and adapts. The second path is erosion. Pushback fades. Precedents harden quietly. Each exceptional move becomes easier to justify than the last. No single moment feels decisive, but the accumulation changes everything. What once required consensus becomes routine. What once demanded explanation becomes assumed. The third path is rupture. Not intentional, not planned. A moment arrives when authority meets reality at full speed. A miscalculation, a confrontation, a crisis that can't be talked around or declared away. At that point, choices collapse into consequences. Which path emerges doesn't depend on speeches or statements. It depends on whether limits are enforced when enforcing them is uncomfortable. And right now, that outcome is still unresolved, which is exactly why the next phase matters more than anything that's already happened. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Systems don't announce when they cross the line from durable to fragile. They look functional right up until they aren't. Nothing you've heard here guarantees collapse. Nothing guarantees correction either. What matters is what gets normalized next. Which questions stop being asked? Which limits stop being enforced? Which tools become reflex instead of exception? Because once that shift completes, it doesn't matter who occupies the office. The shape of power has already changed. And reversing that shape is far harder than preventing it. This isn't about panic. It's about attention. If you stop watching when things get procedural, you miss the moment when procedure becomes permission. And permission becomes precedent. So don't treat this as a finished story. It isn't. This is a hinge moment, one that determines whether authority remains accountable or simply efficient. If you want to understand where this goes, you can't just watch outcomes. You have to track mechanisms. That's what we'll keep doing. Stay with me. Because the next move won't look dramatic. It will look routine. And that's when it matters most.